Red envelope discovery. I thought buying my dream home meant peace and quiet, until a single letter from the HOA changed everything. Overnight, my life became a nightmare of threats, impossible fines, and strangers photographing my yard at midnight. They claimed I'd broken rules I'd never even heard of and demanded a jaw-dropping penalty that could ruin me. But as their intimidation escalated, I uncovered a secret about the very land beneath their homes, one that could flip the power balance forever. So, what happens when the HOA tries to crush the one person who might actually own their entire neighborhood? Dream home arrival. When I first moved to Willow Creek Estates, it felt like stepping into a postcard. Wide sidewalks curled past trimmed hedges, neighbors waved from rocking chairs, and the evening air always smelled faintly of pine. After years of cramped apartments, I finally had space to breathe, an acre of land where I could plant a garden, build a workshop, and let my dog roam free. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough at first. Mr. and Mrs. Keller brought over cookies the day I unloaded boxes, and the HOA president, a sharply dressed woman named Linda, welcomed me with a thick packet of community guidelines. I glanced at the stack, smiled politely, and set it aside. For months, life was blissfully ordinary. I spent weekends staining the porch, planting fruit trees, and watching sunsets from the back deck. But even in those peaceful evenings, there were small hints of something off. A car idling a little too long outside my driveway, a neighbor's curious gaze lingering on the new fence I'd built. I brushed it off, convinced it was just the novelty of a new resident. But the quiet unease settled deeper with each passing week. Little did I know the same rules I'd barely skimmed were about to be twisted into weapons, rules that could turn my dream home into a battleground. The first letter from the HOA arrived on a Tuesday, folded neatly in a bright red envelope that screamed urgent before I even opened it. Inside, a crisp sheet of paper accused me of unauthorized modifications to my property. My crime? Installing a cedar fence on land I owned outright. They demanded I remove it within 10 days or face a $500 a day fine. I reread the letter 3 times, certain there had been a mistake. My deed showed the fence sat well within my boundary line. Still, I called the HOA office. No answer. I left a polite voicemail, then another. Silence. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, this one harsher. It listed new infractions. A shed that was not community approved, garden beds that disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic, and even excessive night lighting, which turned out to be a single solar lamp by the walkway. Each supposed violation carried its own fine, and the total already topped several $1,000s. I tried speaking to Linda, the HOA president. She smiled tightly and said, "Rules are rules. If you don't comply, we escalate." When I asked which rules I'd broken, she simply handed me the thick binder of community guidelines I'd tucked away months earlier and walked off. That night, I noticed a car parked across from my driveway. Its engine idled for nearly an hour before pulling away. The next morning, someone had taken photographs of my fence and left them tucked under my front door with no note. Just the grainy images, like evidence in a trial I hadn't agreed to. I patched together a legal plan, thinking a stern letter from an attorney would end the nonsense. Instead, the HOA doubled down. A week later, I received a certified notice. Daily fines had begun accruing. $500 each day the fence remained, retroactive to the date of their first letter. By their math, I already owed more than $20,000. The pressure mounted in subtle, unsettling ways. A neighbor I'd chatted with at the mailbox began avoiding eye contact. Someone left a dead branch across my garden path, its jagged edges looking almost deliberate. My dog, usually calm, barked late at night at noises I couldn't see. I attended the next HOA meeting, hoping for clarity. The room was a sea of folded arms and tight-lipped stares. When I explained my side, producing property maps and the county's written confirmation that the fence was compliant, Linda barely glanced at the documents. "We vote to uphold the fines," she said, and every board member's hand went up in eerie unison. The tally sheet they passed me showed a staggering total, $74,500 owed. My stomach turned. It wasn't just about money anymore. It felt like they wanted me gone. I began documenting everything: dates, photos, even the late-night cars. One evening, I returned home to find a notice nailed to the fence itself, citing continued non-compliance and threatening legal action to place a lien on my home. That was the breaking point. I hired a real estate attorney who pored over my deed and shook his head in disbelief. "This HOA has no jurisdiction over half the land you own," he said. "In fact," he paused, eyes narrowing as he traced the survey lines. "Do you realize what this means?" His next words changed everything. The association had been collecting dues and enforcing rules on parcels they didn't legally control, including their own clubhouse lot. The discovery lit a fire in me, but I couldn't tip my hand too early. I filed quiet requests for county records, unearthed decades-old plats, and gathered witness statements. Each document painted the same picture. The HOA had expanded its boundaries years ago without proper approval, effectively placing dozens of homes under authority they didn't have. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. Anonymous notes warned, "Sell while you can." Someone loosened the screws on my mailbox so it leaned precariously. At night, the sound of gravel crunching outside kept me awake. My heart hammering, I played along in public, pretending to negotiate, even making small payments under protest to keep them from slapping a lien on my house. Behind the scenes, my attorney and I prepared for the moment to strike. The final straw came with a new certified letter: total balance due, $251,750. The HOA planned to sue for the amount plus legal fees. They expected me to fold. Instead, I scheduled a special meeting and requested to speak. The night of the special HOA meeting, the clubhouse buzzed like a beehive about to swarm. Neighbors packed every chair, the air heavy with gossip and curiosity. Some came to watch a public shaming, others to witness a long brewing feud finally explode. At the front of the room sat the board, 5 stiff-backed figures with Linda at the center, her pearl necklace gleaming like polished armor. I walked in carrying a single black folder. No lawyer, no entourage, just me and a stack of documents that could rewrite the neighborhood's history. Conversations quieted as I approached the podium. "Before we discuss your claim for $251,000, I began, voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. "I need to clarify who actually owns the ground beneath this neighborhood." A ripple of murmurs spread. Linda raised a hand. "This meeting is about your fines, not—" "With respect," I interrupted, "this meeting is about property rights. And you've been enforcing rules on land you don't legally control." I opened the folder and held up a yellowed survey map from the county archives. The parchment crackled like dry leaves. "This is the original plat from 40 years ago. It shows the HOA boundary stops here." I traced the thick line with a fingertip. "Everything beyond this mark, including my lot, the community garden, and your own clubhouse, was never brought under HOA authority." Gasps echoed across the room. Someone whispered, "That can't be right." I turned to face the crowd. "You deserve transparency. You deserve your money back. And you deserve to know that no one can bully you off land that isn't theirs to control." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a full roar. The board members exchanged panicked looks. 2 of them stood and quietly slipped toward the exit. Linda remained frozen, jaw tight. "This isn't over," she hissed, but the threat landed hollow. The neighbors weren't listening to her anymore. They were gathering around me, asking questions, demanding copies of the documents. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I packed my folder, heart pounding with a mix of relief and adrenaline. For months, they'd treated me like a criminal in my own home. Now the balance had shifted entirely. Outside, the cool night air felt different, cleaner, lighter. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now offered firm handshakes and whispered thanks. A few exchanged phone numbers, already talking about forming a new, voluntary association to manage shared spaces without the heavy hand of a rogue board. I paused at the edge of the parking lot and looked back through the clubhouse windows. Linda sat alone at the empty table, the gavel still in her grip, staring at a future she could no longer control. For the first time in months, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. The battle wasn't entirely finished. Lawyers would still trade letters, restitution would take time, but the war for power was over. The neighborhood no longer belonged to a board with forged authority. It belonged to the people who actually lived there. And I walked home under a quiet sky, knowing the next chapter wasn't about fear or fines. It was about freedom, but as the crickets sang in the darkness, one question lingered like an echo. What happens when those who once ruled by intimidation realize they've lost everything? I turned to face the crowd. You deserve transparency. You deserve your money back, and you deserve to know that no one can bully you off land that isn't theirs to control. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a full roar. The board members exchanged panicked looks. Two of them stood and quietly slipped toward the exit. Linda remained frozen, jaw tight. "This isn't over," she hissed, but the threat landed hollow. The neighbors weren't listening to her anymore. They were gathering around me, asking questions, demanding copies of the documents. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I packed my folder, heart pounding with a mix of relief and adrenaline. For months, they'd treated me like a criminal in my own home. Now the balance had shifted entirely. Outside, the cool night air felt different, cleaner, lighter. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now offered firm handshakes and whispered thanks. A few exchanged phone numbers, already talking about forming a new, voluntary association to manage shared spaces without the heavy hand of a rogue board. I paused at the edge of the parking lot and looked back through the clubhouse windows. Linda sat alone at the empty table, the gavel still in her grip, staring at a future she could no longer control. For the first time in months, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. The battle wasn't entirely finished. Lawyers would still trade letters, restitution would take time, but the war for power was over. The neighborhood no longer belonged to a board with forged authority. It belonged to the people who actually lived there. And I walked home under a quiet sky, knowing the next chapter wasn't about fear or fines. It was about freedom, but as the crickets sang in the darkness, one question lingered like an echo. What happens when those who once ruled by intimidation realize they've lost everything? The morning after that explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt transformed. Gone was the tension of surveillance and whispered threats. For the first time in months, I could step outside without scanning the street for idling cars or hidden cameras. The pine-scented air felt lighter, as though the entire community had exhaled. Within a week, 2 board members quietly resigned. Their email statements cited personal reasons, but the truth was plain. The foundation of their authority had cracked wide open. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped by to share stories of fines for ridiculous violations. A garden gnome, a basketball hoop, a trash can placed 6 inches too close to the curb. Each new confession revealed the depth of intimidation we had all endured. My attorney filed the countersuit as planned, and residents quickly joined. Over 30 households became co-plaintiffs, armed with receipts and photographs documenting years of bogus fines. The courthouse clerk joked that our combined evidence could fill an entire filing cabinet. The HOA's official response arrived 3 weeks later, dense with legal jargon and half-hearted excuses about clerical oversights. But the documents we'd collected, original plats, decades-old deeds, even the developer's handwritten notes, left no room for interpretation. Their claim to authority over our properties had always been a fiction. While lawyers traded motions, the neighborhood began to heal. Kids played basketball in driveways without parents worrying about a late-night complaint. Residents planted wildflowers, replaced manicured hedges with colorful gardens, and lingered on front porches, free from the constant anxiety of rule enforcement. It felt as if Willow Creek Estates was waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The lawsuit progressed through the summer. Mediation finally forced the HOA to the table. They agreed to repay every illegal fine with interest and to cover legal fees for every participating household. When restitution checks arrived, some families used the money to repair long-delayed home projects. Others simply saved it as proof that the intimidation had ended. The human impact mattered even more. What started as my personal battle evolved into a shared victory. Strangers became allies. At a community potluck, someone replayed a phone video of the meeting's turning point, the moment I laid the map on the table. Laughter erupted at details that once had been nerve-wracking. Linda's stunned expression, the audible gasp from the crowd, the board members slipping toward the exit. What had once been fear now lived on as neighborhood folklore. As for Linda, the once imposing president, she disappeared almost overnight. A for sale sign appeared in her yard one morning. By evening, the house was dark and empty. Rumors suggested she moved out of state. I felt no triumph in her departure. Only the quiet certainty that unchecked power inevitably collapses under its own weight. Months passed, and the changes took root. Without a domineering board, the community organized on its own terms. We created a voluntary association focused solely on shared maintenance. No fines, no intimidation, just neighbors helping neighbors. Projects were funded by choice, not coercion. People who once avoided each other's gaze now greeted one another with genuine warmth. One spring afternoon, while planting apple trees along my fence line, I found an old HOA notice tucked behind the tool shed. A red envelope faded to pale pink. I smiled at the memory of the fear those envelopes once inspired, then fed it to the compost bin. What had symbolized control now nourished new growth. The story didn't stay contained within Willow Creek. A local paper ran a feature titled, "The HOA That Didn't Own Its Own Land." The article went viral, sparking discussions about homeowners' rights across the state and beyond. Messages poured in from people who faced similar overreach, many thanking us for showing that ordinary residents could push back and win. Neighbors often ask how I managed to stand firm through months of harassment. My answer is simple. Knowing where your property lines end and where your personal dignity begins is worth defending. The HOA's mistake was not only legal, but moral. They forgot that a neighborhood is built on respect, not fear. Today, the cedar fence still stands, weathered by sun and rain, but sturdy as ever. It isn't just wood and nails. It's a monument to perseverance and community solidarity. Each time I walk along its edge, I'm reminded that home is more than a piece of land. It's the freedom to live without intimidation and the responsibility to protect that freedom. Now, when newcomers move into Willow Creek, we share our story around backyard fire pits. Someone inevitably gestures toward the old clubhouse and says with a grin, "That's where the map hit the table." Laughter follows, not because the fight was funny, but because it proved something profound. Ordinary people, armed with truth and persistence, can reclaim their rights and transform an entire neighborhood. So here's the takeaway I offer to anyone listening. Know what you own, know your rights, and never let fear draw your boundaries for you.